All right, we are on air. It is Thursday, December 14th. This is a weekly check-in meeting on active development tasks for Backdrop CMS. Before we get down to what we're working on in Backdrop the product, let's talk about what's been going on in Contrib this week. So we had a couple of new project releases: patch info, simple pick block, and WordPress import. WordPress import I'm personally very excited about. And Opie's currently working on block reference module, but he's asking for people who want to use it to test it and leave feedback in the queue before the first official release comes out. So if you want to grab that one from GitHub, it is ready for testing, though not officially released. It looks like Drush has some updates too. Jeff, do you want to do those?
Yeah, basically last week, Jen and Opie tested a PR for enabling and disabling modules via Drush, and we found some more issues, but Opie presented a fix, and so we're ready for another round of testing, particularly on Drupal 7 when you have the Backdrop Drush extension installed, and also particularly PHP 5.5.
I have a question about that. Is all of the work going on in that branch in your repository called the ongoing saga of N? Is that the branch I should be pulling, or are these separate pull requests elsewhere?
That's the branch.
Okay.
We can't do PHP 5.3 because Drush requires 5.4 or higher for 8.x.
Okay, I can test 5.4.
So that's where we're at with Drush. And if we can get that in, I'd like to cut a 1.0 release.
Okay.
So I think that's a good MVP for some pretty good functionality there.
Okay. I can test that after this meeting.
Great.
I think I did test it after Opie's last change, and it didn't change anything for me, but I wanted to make sure I was testing the right things, because it seemed like the fact that there's work going on and nothing's changing for me seems like the problem might be me. So yeah. I'll try it again today.
Because I don't think he actually pushed his stuff. He just recommended the change. Okay. And then I put it in at some point, but I'm not sure when that was. So maybe there is a little crossover there.
Okay. I'll try again. And then we had been doing some discussion in the pageless nodes issue, and I think decided to pursue the rabbit hole approach, which basically will take nodes and make their paths access denied or otherwise based on settings. And so we decided to try that rabbit hole module, which had been ported to Backdrop by HerbDuel a while ago, and then Laren apparently went in and sorted out some bugs, and so that Contrib module is currently ready for testing. And so I think our plan for future integration would be to test the Contrib module for Backdrop, and if we like that approach, we can then try and figure out how we can take the settings from that Contrib module and merge them into core. I don't think rabbit hole module itself would be moved as a standalone module into core. I think that feature would just become part of node or entity or wherever it is we decide to put it. So we'll just figure out that down the road. But the first step is getting it working for Backdrop. So if anyone has a site that needs to prevent access to a specific node type by its path, that's ready for testing now too. All right, so we have a ton of stuff going on in Contrib. So thank you everybody who's doing all of the amazing work on Contrib, which probably means you're working on sites in Backdrop, which is even more exciting. A bunch of great progress lately. We have a couple of things going on Backdrop CMS websites, like our backdropcms.org main website. Jeff, I know you've been working on this try out Backdrop page. I have intended to test that last week and failed. I'll test it today. I promise. Last week I had an impromptu haircut for my dad that I'd forgotten about. So I'll do it today. And then also happening on our forum site, forum.backdropcms.org is up. We now have adequate spam prevention on it. So hopefully most of our forum posts won't be posted by Russian bots anymore, which is great. And I would encourage anyone who has any questions to jump on there. The last few times I've jumped on there, I've been really impressed by the number of people who are asking questions, and I tend to get distracted and want to spend time answering them for people because people are great. So I would encourage anyone else to just poke around in there and see if there's any questions that you can answer too. I think it looks fantastic. I would love to announce to the world that we have a forum. In order to do that, we need a blog post written on backdropcms.org announcing it. And I had reached out to Doc Wilmot last week asking if he wanted to be the one to write the forum post, since he's the one that did all of the work on getting the forum ready. I haven't heard back from him yet, but it would be good, I think, if we got another person who was interested in writing that blog post in case he decides he doesn't want to write it. I would love this month's newsletter to highlight the forum. We also want to ask kind of a survey to our users to ask what other tools might benefit them in terms of helping them decide to adopt Backdrop or helping them through the actual adoption process. And so I think being able to say, we know you wanted a forum, we built you a forum, what else do you want, is a great way to kind of open that door to taking feedback from people in terms of the tools that they want for working on Backdrop. And so having the post that's like, we built you a forum is going to be really important. And I know Doc Wilmot's really busy working on the forum, and so I don't want to ask too much more of his time as well. But I would love to be able to announce all of the fantastic things that he's done. So if anyone else is interested in working on the forum blog post, let us know. We definitely could use some more help in that area. Okay, that's it for Backdrop Contrib and our infrastructure websites. Nate, do you want to talk a little bit about progress on Backdrop CMS itself?
Sure. So let's talk about the next bug fix release, which is Backdrop 1.8.1. I know that we are closing in on 1.9 here, and we've yet to actually release any bug fix releases for 1.8, but it looks like there's a good chance that may soon happen. Thanks a lot over the past week, actually, or 2 weeks. I wasn't in the meeting last week on tackling bug fixes. And Jeff, I saw that you've been merging fixes into the 1.8 branch, which is very highly appreciated. Thanks for encouraging team collaboration there and getting some issues knocked out. Let's see, there's a number of items that are currently in the RTBC queue, about 8 or so items that have been reviewed by the community. That's fantastic. I started looking through those, and many of them are looking like they're in really great shape. So we'll probably knock out a couple of those today, like cannot delete cloned views, issue 2845. Deleting a node should not validate the form 2594. And I saw you knocked out the add a redirect link shouldn't be shown if you're creating a new node, which of course is obvious. Like, why would you create a redirect if you haven't even created the content yet? Doesn't make any sense. So 2046, that one was knocked out. Awesome. So we'll be doing more issue review today, hopefully during sprinting, and knocking out some of the items that have been piling up. I hate to just keep piling on the praise to one person, but Opie's really been like just knocking this out, like doing tons of great code reviews and moving things forward. So thanks again for all of your work there. Let's see, I always call out these cross ports from Drupal that I'd really like to see finished. We've got 4 issues, 2013, and then 2774, 2775, 2776, that are various cross ports from Drupal 7.50 and higher. And all of them have had pull requests to kind of finish them up, but haven't gotten completed. Although I know with time running out for code freeze on 1.9. Those might not be the highest priority things because we can always continue doing bug fixes after feature freeze, which is January 1st. So at this point, like, yeah, it would be great if we can get those merged in or get those fixed up so that we could include them in 1.8.1 sooner. But really, they're just not as high priority as adding new functionality is for the 1.9 release. So yeah, as always, it would be nice to get those in, but I'm not sweating them at the moment, at least. Let's see. So that's the status of things generally for 1.8 minor release and bug fixes there. Anything else you guys would like to add regarding fixes that have been happening recently? No? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about 1.9. 1.9 media library still is our highest priority item here, and we're still kind of stuck in the same pattern, or holding pattern here, that we're hung up on issue 2796, which is the ability to edit an existing file. Still really close on that, but we just haven't seen activity there. I know my pull request is the last version that was put up there a while back. If anybody wants to pick that up, that would be a huge help. Just post that issue and saying, hey, I'm going to work on this. Otherwise, I'll assume that I'll still be the one to work on it. But yeah, don't feel like it's not an opportunity. After editing existing file is completed 2796, it kind of unblocks the subsequent issues field bundle or file entity bundles, which is 2632, and uploading a file independently of other types of content, 2633. We've only got 2 weeks left, I know, before feature freeze. I don't feel that like these are super ambitious features. I think we can still knock them out for 1.9. And we do need something. Like 1.9 right now is essentially the same thing as 1.8. And I mean, we've been seeing a lot of community activity in peripheral activities outside of core, in Contrib, in the forums, in the website, the showcase. We've had a lot of really exciting movement over the past couple of months, but most of that activity hasn't been in the core queue. And that's fine. But it still would be good of us to get something as a banner feature for 1.9 to show progress in the actual product. So hoping file management, we can still put those things together. Let's see. We've got a new item in the agenda here. Translation has been a really hot topic. With the translation extractor getting updated, the translation server, localized.backdropcms.org kind of coming together. And Jeff, you've been doing a little bit of communicating, working with Olaf these past couple of weeks. Do you want to talk about this translation section?
Sure. Yeah, we made a conscious effort to start making Backdrop for Good website a use case for making a translated website for multiple languages. And that's going great, and we're revealing issues and sorting them out, which ones are kind of core issues and which ones are site-specific issues. So that's kind of what's driving a lot of this. And Olaf is doing great with coordinating us and helping us, especially folks like myself that don't really understand the core concepts of translating. So I'm getting better because he's helping. So from that came in the internationalization module, there's the ability to hide the navigation links that are displayed per node. So we ported that into core, and there were some updates on that based on some feedback from Nate last week or 2 weeks ago maybe. And that has an upgrade path, not just for that one feature. So that's ready for review, and we'd like to get that in so we could get that onto our working websites. And then the CMI translation. So this is basically being brought up because of blocks. So we want to be able to translate blocks, and blocks are configuration. So there's no reason to not translate everything. So I made a start on that to make this get translated function. But I'm not sure how hook config info and potx play into it. So maybe if we could get our heads together and get maybe a little better outline, I'd love to continue working there. And then block translation that came up because of backdrop for good. Yeah, that's stuff I already spoke about. Yeah, so some exciting work there, and it's been great working with folks on this stuff.
Yeah, awesome. I've got some ideas regarding how hook config info might play into things, and I've been brainstorming some other alternatives there because I think we might have some better options. I'm going to write that up right now and get that posted by the end of the meeting, probably.
Great.
Or we can do an after talk afterwards. So, okay, awesome. Yeah, all of that's very exciting. Yeah, and translation has been an item that we had slated for 1.8, but when things don't happen, sometimes we'll give a cycle to kind of let things incubate for a little while and see if we can hit it for the next release. But yeah, 1.9 is still in play. We're just not targeting it as like we absolutely want this to happen, but it might, and that would be really fantastic. Oh, okay. I think that's it for the product update for 1.9. That's it. Ta-da. We go into general discussion and Q&A. And it's funny, it looks like the only item that we've actually got here in the agenda is actually talking about configuration management translation. So maybe we should roll into that. Okay, I'll try to summarize the issue here. So we're talking about issue 704, which is add config translation, in which, Jeff, can you talk about how the pull request currently works? You have a call to config, and then you say get translated, and then you specify the key. Oh, I see. And then you pass in args like as you would for the T function. Oh, that makes sense. So when you say get translated, you specify the key of the config item that you want to translate, but then you also need to specify the substitutions like you would in the T function. That makes sense. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So the question then comes into how we make the string extractor, the POTX module, aware of what strings are translatable by looking at a module. So if a module had some config had some translated strings, so strings that need to be translated in config, how would the translation extractor identify those strings as saying, these strings need to be translated and put them into a POT file? The translation template file is what a POT file is. Early on, I had suggested that, okay, let's first of all compare ourselves to Drupal 8 here and how Drupal 8 managed this problem. Is that they created schema files for their config files. So all of their config also has a separate schema file. So every config file has two files. one for the actual values and then one for the schema. And the schema specifies data types, like is this a string or is this an integer? But it also has more complex things other than just string and integer, like this thing is a translated string. Where that gets messy, though, is that schemas can be like groups of things can be repeated. Like if you have a view and you specify, hey, these are the filters that are applied to the view, those filters can be repeating. So it's not quite just so simple as saying, this static string will always be this particular type of data, because you end up with dynamic data structures that can be expanded like into really big things. So the schemas get really complicated. I was thinking about initially co-opting the idea of schema, but instead of using a separate schema file, we'd use hook config info as say, these are the keys that are translatable. And that solves the basic problem of which strings within the config file are translated, but doesn't solve the how do we deal with complex data structures that like we don't know what the keys are that need to be translated quite yet. So that was my initial idea. And the new idea that I'm thinking about is instead of doing it through hook config info or a schema file, because dealing with those complex data structures is a problem in both of those solutions. It's complicated and it's hard to describe that data format. A new idea instead is at the time that we write the config file, like let's say views is saving the view config file. It's responsible for adding all of the keys, adding all the values, and then at the very end it says config arrow save, and it saves the config file. I was thinking, what if at that time, before we call the save method on a config item, if we also had the ability in views to say, config arrow set translatable, and then the key, and then true or false. And that would save into the config file itself an array of all of the translatable keys. So up at the top of the config file, we currently store some really basic metadata, like the name of the config is in the config file itself, as well as whether or not the config file uses static in-memory caching. Underscore config underscore static equals true, I think is what it's called. And I was thinking that using that same like config metadata concept, we would use this method that says like set translatable and then take a key. And if you set something as translatable, it would add to an array up at the top of the file that would be like underscore config underscore translations, or underscore config underscore config underscore translatables, or something like that. And then it's just a big array of all of the keys. And then what the POT extractor module would do is it wouldn't have to do anything crazy with like parsing schemas and then finding all the keys. It would literally just read the config files and say what keys are translated in here, and pull that list out of the config file, and then find the associated keys and say these are the keys that need to be translated in this file. So it wouldn't do any logic or expansion of like reading a schema and then saying these are the keys. It would literally just say, give me the keys, and then get the associated keys and say these strings need to be translated. So basically it shifts the responsibility of this being like a magic thing that happens like with one thing over here, and then on save, it combines the two things together and then magically creates like a list of translated strings, and instead just requires that modules, if they want translated strings, before they call config arrow save, they say which keys are translatable beforehand. And I'm writing that up in a way that, that it doesn't need to be understood via a hangout in the middle of the week, but I think that might work. What do you think, Jeff?
That sounds great. In the case of blocks, so that would be the block module. So we could like set in the translatables array in the config file the body value or whatever we want, really. So like with nodes, you know, in the node table, there's like a canonical language node, and then the other ones have references to that node ID.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the, if your URL is like mysite.com/en, then it knows to figure out which one is the English node or the French node and so on. So how can we make this kind of reference system with blocks? Can we like save a UUID to the block config file or something like that?
So because blocks are config, kind of by design, you know, they are going to use like a different translation system than content, because content, like nodes and taxonomy terms, have content translation, but config is using a separate system because things that are in the config files are considered to be, well, not content. So what that would ultimately mean for this would be, I'm not sure this would work well for body or for node. God, what am I saying? For block body content. But just because it wouldn't work well doesn't mean it wouldn't work. Because what you'd end up with is you'd end up with a long string of text that is the body content of the block. And then that string would be registered into the, I don't know the name of the table, but the locale module table for like, this is a translated or translatable string. And then someone would go into the locale module interface and find untranslated strings, and they would be able to translate that entire string. So basically, the block content would be run through T ultimately. So it wouldn't be managed in a way that there would be you know, different blocks and like a different interface saying like edit the French version of this block, edit the Spanish version of this block. It would literally be go over to the interface translation UI and then find the block string and then translate it via locale module.
I think that makes the most sense for config translation stuff. So like blocks that are config. And if we have blocks that are content, like pageless node style, then it would make more sense to have the like edit the French, edit the Spanish version of the block.
Yeah, you know, once, I mean, the suggested approach here that we're ultimately running config translation through T, we're doing it this way because this is basically the way config is translated right now. It's just that it's a manual process and we're running the T function on variables. So this basically just evolves the concept to make it officially supported. But once doing this approach, we basically can re-leverage the locale module to do config translation, and we don't explicitly need a new user interface to translate config-based strings, which is nice. But you could make an interface that manages config-based strings that says like on a settings form, you know, you save it, and then maybe the settings form could also have another tab that is like translate and translate all the settings that were in the form that you were just in. And it could do that by taking a look at the config file, seeing what keys are in the config file that need to be translated, and then making a page that is just the strings for that particular config file, and you could translate them independently of the rest of the user interface. So that could be like an optional, like improvement if you wanted an easier way to find your strings rather than needing to use the locale module to go and independently find those strings, then translate them as part of the rest of your website.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, what you said, Nate, because, for example, look at custom blocks, which may be editable by content editors. And firstly, it's very complicated to go to the user interface translation page. To translate a body. Also, the interface is not adapted for this use case, I think. You have very small widgets, text widgets, and so on. And maybe they have not the permission to translate the interface and so on. So it would be nice if they could, the person who does a configuration has also the possibility to translate it right at the place. That would solve the permission problem, also the interface problem. So I think that makes perfectly sense. And using the user interface translation is also sort of misleading because it's not the user interface. It's configuration.
Yep. Yeah, it doesn't work real great for blocks. It would work, but it's not. It's definitely not a good solution.
Yeah, but so we talked a lot about the custom blocks, and I don't know if you had the ability to follow it. We also talked about the node as block approach, which is more workaround, which is also the reason why we pushed the activities for Rabbit Hole, where you can use nodes and hide them and use them instead of custom blocks, which solves, I think, a lot of problems, because custom blocks are also problematic permission-wise. And at top of that, if you use nodes, you can also add other fields, like an image field and so on. So I think that's a very good solution, but it's, I think more a solution for experienced site builders and not for first-time users of Backdrop. And I had the idea, if we could rebuild custom blocks, maybe not at the moment, but maybe for the release, don't know, 1.10 or 1.11, in a way that it internally uses these hidden nodes.
So the block save nodes. Yeah.
In a way,
I think that we actually,
what we do now as a workaround, which a site builder can do, we could arrange it internally so that these certain kind of nodes would be used for custom blocks, and it would solve a lot of problems: permissions, fieldability, and translation at the same time. Just an idea.
Yeah, I wonder if we could also, there's problems with this, but maybe, there are problems, but maybe we just acknowledge them and say, yeah, that's a problem. Like the one I'm thinking about in particular is that any type of fieldable entity putting it into a layout is mixing configuration and content, because the content is stored in the database and the layout is stored in configuration. And as soon as you have anything that's fieldable content placed into a layout, you've bound the two together, which makes moving configuration between environments a lot messier, because sometimes the content won't exist on the destination location.
Yeah, we already do that with
Yeah.
fields and layouts or existing content.
Yeah, but yeah, we explicitly allowed that when we said it's okay for you to just place a node into a layout, and then that's a design decision that you've made for your website, that you're mixing together your content and your configuration. And when we built out blocks, we specifically made them configuration to make it so that blocks could be moved across environments without binding them to content. So that's intentional. But I think your suggestion is still a good one. That's we need a way to make some translatable block a lot easier. And if it really turns out to be like maybe just embedding nodes needs to be made an easier process, and that would also solve the problem of translation. And I think we still, that issue 100, the make a system of URL-less nodes / or make an entity that just doesn't have a path on it. Something that could be used as a content block, basically. Those are open issues that either one that we implement might solve this translation problem kind of as a side effect. So yeah, I think let's continue pursuing options there. And maybe this isn't specifically a translation problem. Maybe it's just a problem of how do we make it easier to embed pieces of content into a layout. That might be what we're working with here. Or finding a way to make it so that we can embed content within a layout that somehow doesn't bind it so tightly to the configuration. And I have no idea what that would look like, but something like I don't know. Some things I've seen before have been like, let's place a view in the layout, and the view is specifically filtered to be like 1 or 2 pieces of content, but not based on node ID, based on some other selection criteria. And then that makes it so that the view is pulling out the content that you want, and the view, it does the query to select the content, but doesn't explicitly include any IDs or anything like that. It's all dynamically figured out at the time. But those are complex solutions. And I think that if we could find ways to streamline that with a lot simpler pre-made solutions to solve common use cases, then that would be a great thing.
Yeah, it's however tricky, I think, because configuration content will overlap. We can't separate them totally. Think of menus and so on. And I think also Drupal 8, they still have issues with it because it's not totally separable.
Yep, it's really not. But the benefits that we get from having config attempted to be separate and explicitly separate is still just a huge gain, even though it isn't perfect.
I see.
Yeah, just getting all of that stuff out of the database is just a huge boon.
Yeah.
All right. So basically, problems, we're working on them.
Yeah, but I found it nice the last 2 weeks because we identified a lot of issues, and there was sort of focus and motivation to solve exactly these problems, with the use case in mind from Backdrop for Good. So it was good decision to try that, I think.
Yeah, and this is awesome that this config translation is moving forward. That's really exciting. Okay, I'm going to continue writing up kind of my summary that I talked about in this config translation issue, just so that we can talk about it offline as well. And yeah, let's keep cracking on and stuff. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you everybody for joining. Great meeting today. Lots of really exciting work happening across the spectrum of the world of Backdrop. So that's it. Thank you guys all for coming, and we'll see you guys next week. Goodbye.